A strong narrative hook is the lifeline of any emotionally driven story, and in this competitor script, the opening tension hook is crafted with exceptional precision. The moment the mother asks, "Why didn't you come to your sister's baby shower?" becomes the narrative detonator, a single line that ignites the plot, exposes long-suppressed wounds, reveals the family dynamic, and immediately immerses the audience into the emotional battlefield. This hook works because it doesn't rely on physical danger or dramatic action. It relies on social danger, the risk of humiliation, misunderstanding, and forced accountability. The writer uses the setting of a warm, festive Thanksgiving dinner to sharpen the contrast. The room is described as settling into warm chatter, a phrase that signals comfort, familiarity, and family unity. But right when the audience settles in, the script rips the rug away. The mother's question doesn't just interrupt the conversation, it violates the emotional safety of the protagonist. This creates instant psychological tension. The dialogue is crafted with intentional public volume, loud enough that relatives 3 chairs down can hear. This detail is crucial. It turns a mother-daughter conflict into a public trial, a moment where Ashley is forced into the spotlight she never wanted. The hook leverages the power of audience discomfort. We feel embarrassed on Ashley's behalf, which immediately aligns us with her emotionally. Another device at play is stillness versus eruption. While the room reacts, eyebrows lifting, chatter fading, heads turning, Ashley does not blink. The writer paints her stillness in slow motion, placing the napkin down slowly, feeling her pulse steady. This silence isn't weakness, it is a symbol of years of learned restraint. It gives her a quiet, simmering power that contrasts sharply with the public aggression from her mother. Viewers subconsciously sense that Ashley has spent a lifetime being blamed, misunderstood, and overshadowed, and this moment, is merely the latest repetition of an old pattern. The hook also uses misdirection. The mother's accusation implies Ashley ignored the shower out of spite or drama, a seed that feeds the audience's curiosity. Why didn't she go? What happened? But the line, "They assumed too much," the signature told a different story, is strategically placed right after the confrontation. It's a breadcrumb, a hint that flips the script from accusation to mystery. That single line promises the viewer that the truth is far more complex and that Ashley, the quiet one, holds information that will unravel the family narrative. Structurally, this opener serves multiple purposes. It establishes conflict. It defines character roles. It plants emotional stakes. It creates a subtle sense of injustice that hooks viewers. It foreshadows a dramatic reveal. The hook also uses unresolved emotional imbalance. The question isn't just about a shower. It represents years of inequality, favoritism, and invisibility. The writer cleverly wraps history into a single moment, letting the weight of the past throb beneath the surface. This hook succeeds because it's layered, sharp, and emotionally loaded, an invitation into a story about truth, silence, and long-awaited exposure. Identity is never created in isolation. It is shaped in the quiet corners of childhood, in the shadows of living rooms, over dinner tables where words are spoken, and sometimes more dangerously, where they are not. In this section, we dig into the family dynamics that silently engineered the emotional architecture of the narrator. This isn't just a surface-level reading of sibling rivalry or parental expectations. It is an excavation of the forces that sculpt a person's sense of self before they even realize they have one. At the center of this dynamic lies a question: who am I? When every room tells me something different, the narrator's childhood was a battlefield of shifting roles: dutiful child in one moment, invisible shadow in the next. Parents, often unintentionally, handed down labels like inherited curses: responsible one, troublemaker, quiet one, the strong one. And slowly, painfully, these labels hardened into identity. The narrator didn't grow into them, they were pushed into them. Family dynamics create identities the same way pressure creates diamonds. But pressure can also create fractures. The narrator learned early that belonging came with conditions. Approval had to be earned, affection could disappear, and silence was sometimes safer than honesty. This emotional economy where validation cost obedience shaped their internal world. They became hyper-aware of others' moods, anticipating emotional storms before they arrived. This is a classic pattern of children raised in unpredictable households. They become watchers, analysts, emotional translators. Sibling dynamics reinforced this pattern. In the narrator's home, every sibling had a role to play in the unspoken theater of family love. Some roles were rewarded with affection, others were punished with neglect. The narrator's role was ambiguous, caught between being the voice of reason and the emotional sponge for everyone else. They absorbed what others refused to confront. They became the fixer, not because they wanted to, but because the environment required it. These dynamics bleed into identity formation in subtle ways. A child who grows up suppressing their needs becomes an adult who apologizes for having them. A child who learns that success is the only way to earn attention becomes addicted to achievement. A child who is taught to stay silent becomes terrified of conflict. The narrator is shaped by these survival strategies, which become reflexes, which become personality until one day they can't tell where coping mechanism ends and identity begins, and beneath all of this lies a deeper theme. The fear of disappointing the people who shaped you. It is a fear that governs choices long after childhood ends. Careers are chosen to please. Relationships are maintained to avoid conflict. Dreams are postponed because they seem too selfish. And when the narrator finally confronts the question of identity, they are forced to face a painful truth. What they believe is who I am might actually be who I had to be. This section also reveals how the family dynamic becomes a blueprint for every future relationship. If love was conditional, love becomes something to earn. If boundaries were punished, boundaries become terrifying. If emotional expression was unsafe, vulnerability becomes impossible. The narrator carries these silent instructions into adulthood, unaware that they are reenacting old patterns. Identity, then, is not merely self-discovery, it is also self-correction. The narrator must unlearn the roles imposed by family, dismantle the survival mechanisms, and rebuild a sense of self that is independent, autonomous, and authentic. This section is the psychological engine of the story, showing us how the past programs the present, and how breaking free from it becomes the narrator's quiet rebellion. Adulthood does not erase childhood, it simply adds new rooms to an old house. By the time the narrator steps into their adult life, they are carrying decades of internal architecture built from family expectations, survival patterns, and emotional scripts they never wrote. This section examines how those invisible forces shape the narrator's decisions, relationships, self-worth, and ultimately how they respond when the life-altering news of a pregnancy enters the narrative like a lightning strike. In adulthood, the narrator appears functional, maybe even successful, but beneath the exterior lies a quiet fracture. They navigate responsibilities with practiced competence, yet each achievement feels strangely hollow. This is a classic pattern for individuals raised in high-pressure family dynamics. Adulthood becomes a performance. The narrator moves through the world with the same emotional reflexes forged in childhood, pleasing others, avoiding conflict, seeking stability, fearing disappointment. Their identity is a delicate balancing act between who they've been told to be and who they might actually be. Relationships in adulthood are deeply colored by these earlier experiences. The narrator might choose partners who feel familiar, not realizing familiar often means emotionally distant, unpredictable, or demanding, mirroring their family environment. Or they might gravitate toward relationships that provide the stability they never had, only to feel suffocated by the expectation to be vulnerable. In either case, intimacy becomes both desired and feared, and the narrator's emotional world becomes complex terrain. Then comes the moment everything changes, the pregnancy reveal. It doesn't enter the story gently, it arrives as a seismic shift. Whether planned or unexpected, wanted or feared, the news uproots every carefully arranged piece of the narrator's adult identity. Pregnancy symbolizes continuation, legacy, responsibility, but also confrontation. Suddenly, the narrator must face all the patterns they inherited, all the wounds they never addressed, all the echoes of their past that they might pass on to someone else. This reveal forces the narrator to reckon with questions they've avoided for years. What does it mean to create a life when I'm still figuring out my own? Can I be the parent I needed but never had? Will I repeat the cycles I swore I'd break? Do I have the emotional foundation to raise a child without fear, guilt, or unresolved anger? The pregnancy acts as a mirror. It exposes how fragile the narrator's adult stability actually is. It also reveals how deeply they have internalized the roles assigned in childhood: caretaker, fixer, peacekeeper. Now those roles collide with a new, overwhelming responsibility that demands authenticity instead of performance, and this moment is not just psychologically heavy, it is emotionally volatile. The narrator might feel joy, fear, denial, excitement, regret, hope all at once. The reveal becomes a narrative crossroads, a point where the narrator must choose between repeating the past and forging a new identity grounded in agency and self-awareness. Importantly, the pregnancy doesn't simply raise the stakes, it reframes the entire story. It transforms the narrator from someone shaped by their family to someone who must now define family. It forces them to rebuild their sense of self not as a product of upbringing but as a future parent. This is the moment the story shifts from introspection to transformation, from survival to responsibility, from inherited pain to potential healing. This section serves as the emotional spine of the narrative, the point where adulthood collides with legacy, where identity meets responsibility, and where the narrator must decide who they will become for themselves, and for the life growing inside them. Hope often enters a story quietly, almost shyly, after long stretches of emotional heaviness. In this section, the baby shower becomes more than a celebration, it becomes a symbolic reconstruction of everything the narrator once feared they could never have: community, belonging, joy, and a future unshaped by past trauma. On the surface, a baby shower is a simple event. But in this narrative, It becomes an emotional milestone, a soft, glowing moment suspended between the scars of yesterday and the fragile dreams of tomorrow. For the narrator, planning the baby shower is both exhilarating and terrifying. Hope is a foreign emotion for someone conditioned by unpredictable family dynamics. Growing up, happiness always felt temporary, something that could be taken away by a raised voice, a disappointed look, or a shift in the household atmosphere. So when the narrator begins preparing for this celebration, there is a subtle psychological tension. Can I trust this happiness? Yet the act of planning itself becomes a form of healing. Every detail, the colors, the decorations, the guest list represents a quiet rebellion against their past. They are designing a moment of joy that no one else has control over. They are creating a space where love is intentional, not conditional. This is the first time the narrator actively builds an environment of emotional safety instead of merely surviving inside someone else's. The baby shower planning also becomes a form of identity transformation. Instead of being the fixer or caretaker for others, the narrator is now preparing to welcome a life who depends on them. That responsibility carries weight, but also light. It allows them to stand on the threshold of becoming a parent with a sense of purpose instead of fear. The event symbolizes the moment the narrator begins imagining the future not as a continuation of old wounds, but as something new, something theirs. There is also a subtle theme of community. The narrator begins to see support coming from unexpected places: friends, co-workers, relatives who were once distant. This softens the narrator's long-held belief that they must handle everything alone. Planning the baby shower shows them that they are not isolated, and that love can come from places outside their childhood script. This realization becomes a small but powerful emotional victory. At the same time, shadows of vulnerability linger. As they plan the celebration, intrusive doubts whisper, "Do I deserve this happiness? What if something goes wrong? Will I be a good parent?" These fears coexist with hope, creating a bittersweet emotional palette. But unlike earlier sections, hope dominates not by silencing the fears, but by standing beside them. The narrator realizes that hope is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite it. In cinematic storytelling terms, the baby shower planning acts as a breath, a moment of warmth and anticipation before deeper conflict arrives later. It is the soft rising note in a symphony that has been largely composed of tension and uncertainty. Most importantly, this section shows us that the narrator is beginning to rewrite their emotional destiny. By planning a celebration centered on life, joy, and connection, they are symbolically choosing to break generational cycles. They are choosing love over fear, creation over trauma, and hope over the shadows of their past. The baby shower becomes a moment where the narrator steps fully into their future, not as a continuation of what shaped them, but as the architect of what comes next. The tension that has been quietly building through childhood neglect, adult isolation, and fragile hope reaches its apex on the day of the baby shower. In this section, the competitor's script masterfully transforms what could be a simple celebratory moment into a slow-burning emotional earthquake. The narrative relies not on external catastrophe but on the power of absence, using silence, empty spaces, and deferred expectations to evoke a visceral response in the audience. The day begins with sunlight and small domestic rituals that are deliberately warm, string lights softly glowing, desserts arranged with care, chairs fluffed, and the subtle scent of vanilla and citrus filling the air. These details are meticulously designed to evoke normalcy, comfort, and intimacy. Yet every carefully planned element serves as a mirror against which absence will be felt even more keenly. This juxtaposition between the narrator's effort and the reality of isolation amplifies the emotional stakes. What should be a communal celebration instead becomes an exercise in silent endurance, a stark contrast that the audience can immediately sense. The narrative uses temporal stretching to heighten tension. Hours pass slowly, each chime of the elevator, each anticipated knock at the door, magnifying the narrator's anxiety. By recounting the exact duration of waiting, the script draws readers into a shared experience of suspended hope and mounting dread. The effect is almost cinematic. We can imagine the camera lingering on empty chairs, the protagonist's repeated glances toward the entrance, the muted ticking of a clock that seems louder than normal. Every sensory detail reinforces the central theme of invisibility, the idea that the narrator's existence and their joy have been overlooked, not just by strangers but by those closest to them. This moment is also an emotional crucible, where childhood patterns of neglect intersect with adult vulnerability. The narrator's anticipation, disappointment, and self-reassurance reflect decades of learned survival behavior. Years of quiet observation and emotional restraint have trained them to manage pain alone, and this section underscores that skill but also its cost. The absence of family members isn't just logistical, it is profoundly symbolic. Chairs that remain unoccupied become stand-ins for past injustices, unnoticed birthdays, lost gifts, and unacknowledged achievements. The audience feels the echo of these old wounds in the empty apartment. The inclusion of supportive friends, such as Jenna, contrasts sharply with the painful absence of family, emphasizing both the narrator's isolation and the possibility of chosen community. Jenna's presence acts as a soft buffer but also as a reminder that the void left by family is both tangible and deliberate. This careful layering of characters allows the audience to feel the emotional complexity, gratitude for friendship entwined with sorrow at familial neglect. Narratively, The Baby Shower Day is a masterclass in tension through silence. The lack of dramatic confrontation is the point. The emotional punch comes from the contrast between expectation and reality, preparation and abandonment. The section demonstrates how absence can be weaponized narratively, how the unfulfilled promise of celebration can tell the story of a lifetime of neglect. The audience, immersed in the narrator's perspective, experiences disappointment as if it were their own, creating empathy and investment in the story's unfolding. Finally, this section sets up the coming revelation. The emotional weight of the day primes the audience for the discovery that nothing was accidental. The absence is no longer just painful, it becomes the clue to a deliberate act of sabotage. The stage is set for truth, justice, and eventual reclamation of agency. In narrative storytelling, tension often grows in stages, and the first clear signal that something is wrong, the red flag, is critical for audience engagement. In this story, that red flag arrives in the form of a brief, dismissive message from Vanessa, a moment that transforms the narrator's vague unease into a sharp, directed awareness of betrayal. The beauty of this section lies in its economy. A few words, devoid of emotion, convey far more than paragraphs of exposition could. The competitor uses minimalism as a narrative weapon, allowing subtext, tone, and the protagonist's internal reaction to carry the weight of the drama. This message is deliberately understated, almost casual in appearance. Next time, plan earlier, sis. There is no apology, no acknowledgement, no empathy, nothing but a tone of condescension. The simplicity of the text highlights the cruelty embedded in everyday interactions. Unlike a dramatic confrontation that would immediately force an emotional response, this subtle act of undermining forces both the protagonist and the audience to pause and analyze. The story uses the contrast between expectation and delivery masterfully. The narrator expects support or at least recognition, and the stark absence of either makes the slight sting sharper and more memorable. Psychologically, the red flag moment is a turning point for the narrator. Throughout the story, they have carried the quiet weight of past neglect, the slow accumulation of being overlooked and undervalued. This message does more than frustrate, it activates a cognitive recognition pattern honed over years. Something is deliberately wrong here. In this brief digital interaction, Vanessa's text functions as both a mirror and a warning. The audience sees the protagonist's trained attention to detail, the quiet, internal alertness developed through years of family dynamics where nothing is as it seems. The tension is now no longer vague, it has a target. The narrative also demonstrates the power of pacing here. By placing this message after the lonely, painful hours of the baby shower, the script ensures that its emotional resonance is maximized. The audience is already primed. The protagonist's hopes, care, and efforts have been met with absence. The red flag lands like a cold wind, confirming fears that lingered at the edges of the story. It is a carefully calibrated escalation that turns passive disappointment into active suspicion. Moreover, the section introduces a structural pivot, the shift from emotional experience to investigative action. The protagonist does not immediately confront or accuse. Instead, they move toward evidence gathering, checking the baby registry and revisiting delivery tracking. This demonstrates a crucial narrative technique, the transition from feeling to agency. The subtle threat embedded in Vanessa's message sparks the narrator's active engagement with the truth, setting the stage for a climactic reveal. Finally, this moment exemplifies how the story uses digital communication as a narrative device. The brevity of the text, the absence of tone markers, and the protagonist's interpretation all magnify tension. The audience understands that in relationships marked by subtle cruelty, small gestures carry enormous significance. One line of text is enough to append confidence, provoke reflection, and drive the story forward. The red flag, though understated, is the hinge upon which the narrative turns. It converts emotional suspense into investigative determination, propels the plot toward revelation, and underscores the story's themes of betrayal, awareness, and the quiet power of the observant protagonist. In storytelling, the discovery moment often functions as the turning point, transforming suspicion into undeniable reality. In this narrative, the discovery of the signatures is more than a plot device, it is the emotional and psychological culmination of years of invisible struggle, silenced pain, and carefully restrained observation. The competitor's script executes this section with meticulous layering, balancing revelation, tension, and internal reflection to create a scene that is both gripping and cathartic. The act of uncovering the truth is described with deliberate slowness. The protagonist does not immediately open the files, mirroring the psychological hesitation inherent in confronting long-buried betrayals. This pause heightens anticipation for the audience and reflects the careful, methodical nature of the narrator, someone who has spent a lifetime observing patterns, analyzing behavior, and reading hidden cues. By delaying the reveal, the narrative builds suspense without relying on dramatic external action, demonstrating how introspection and careful attention can become a source of narrative tension in their own right. The signatures themselves are loaded with symbolic weight. Each one represents a deliberate, calculated act of exclusion by Vanessa. By visually detailing the exact matching strokes, the swoop of the V, the flourish at the end, the narrative emphasizes the precision and intention behind the act. This is not a vague misstep or an accident of logistics, it is deliberate, repeated interference. The protagonist's recognition of this pattern underscores both her perceptiveness and the subtle cruelty of her sister, adding layers to the conflict. The audience is forced to reckon with the emotional gravity. Betrayal can exist in quiet, bureaucratic forms, and its impact can be profound, structurally. This section is pivotal because it transforms the protagonist from a passive sufferer into an agent of knowledge. The discovery shifts the narrative from lingering doubt to concrete understanding, empowering the narrator to take action. The careful presentation of evidence, tracking logs, timestamps, and signatures serves as a narrative bridge between suspicion and confrontation. It is a transition from emotional processing to strategic clarity, emphasizing that the protagonist's response will be measured, deliberate, and grounded in undeniable truth rather than impulsive anger. Psychologically, the discovery also crystallizes a long history of familial neglect and favoritism. The protagonist is not reacting merely to a missed baby shower but to decades of being overshadowed, ignored, and undervalued. The repetition of the signature across multiple invitations echoes the repetition of past slides, transforming the present moment into a reflection of an entire lifetime. The audience experiences the weight of these cumulative injustices alongside the narrator, which deepens empathy and engagement. Finally, this section demonstrates the power of subtle evidence as narrative leverage. The competitor shows that revelations need not be sensational, they can be procedural, precise, and profoundly impactful. By grounding betrayal in documentation rather than emotion alone, the script achieves both credibility and emotional intensity. The discovery of the signatures is not merely a turning point, it is a reclamation of agency, a moment of clarity, and a catalyst for the protagonist's eventual confrontation and self-affirmation. In essence, the discovery of the signatures combines suspense, symbolism, and psychological resonance. It crystallizes the protagonist's journey from doubt to certainty, from invisibility to acknowledgement, setting the stage for the dramatic resolution of the story. In narrative construction, the gathering of evidence is rarely just a mechanical plot point, it is an emotional journey, a slow unspooling of tension and agency that mirrors the protagonist's internal transformation. In this story, the act of collecting tracking logs, signatures, and timestamps is more than an investigative step, it is a moment of psychological empowerment, a turning point where the narrator moves from helplessness into controlled awareness. This section reveals how the competitor's script uses procedural detail to heighten suspense while simultaneously deepening character development. The process begins with meticulous attention to detail. Each step, retrieving shipping receipts, cross-referencing timestamps, isolating signatures, is described in a way that emphasizes deliberate care. By highlighting the narrator's methodical approach, the script conveys both intelligence and emotional precision. The audience witnesses not merely the assembly of evidence, but the careful orchestration of facts that will later support the climactic confrontation. This narrative technique reinforces the theme that truth is often discovered through patience, observation, and quiet determination rather than dramatic flair. Parallel to the procedural aspect is the emotional shift occurring within the protagonist. As the evidence accumulates, the initial feelings of confusion, doubt, and hurt begin to crystallize into clarity and purpose. The transition is gradual but palpable. The narrator moves from passive despair to active comprehension, a psychological progression mirrored in the deliberate pacing of the evidence gathering. The narrative allows readers to inhabit the protagonist's internal world, experiencing the subtle, growing sense of validation and control that comes from confirming suspicions with concrete proof. The competitor's script also uses sensory and environmental cues to enhance the emotional weight of this moment. Descriptions of the printer working noisily in the silent apartment, the tactile sensation of sorting papers into neat stacks, and the protagonist's controlled breathing transform a procedural act into a cinematic tableau. Every detail amplifies the tension, making the evidence gathering feel intimate and immediate, while reflecting the protagonist's internal focus and determination. Silence here becomes a tool, emphasizing the contrast between the narrator's past invisibility and current assertive action. This section further highlights the narrative function of emotional reclamation through action. The protagonist is no longer subject to the whims of family neglect. Instead, they are actively constructing a narrative they can control. The careful collection of evidence is symbolic of reclaiming lost agency. Every printed page and logged timestamp represents a small victory over years of being overlooked, ignored, or minimized. The emotional shift is subtle yet profound. The narrator moves from vulnerability to empowerment, from doubt to confidence, preparing both themselves and the audience for the eventual confrontation. Finally, the gathering of evidence sets the stage for thematic resonance. It transforms private hurt into undeniable truth, showing the audience that meticulous documentation, patience, and calm precision can serve as forms of resistance and assertion. The protagonist's emotional shift is emblematic of the story's broader themes: clarity over confusion, agency over passivity, and the quiet triumph of being seen and acknowledged. In essence, this section blends procedural precision with psychological depth. The evidence gathering is not only a bridge to the climax but also a narrative vehicle for transformation, signaling that the protagonist has evolved from a silent observer into a deliberate, empowered actor within their own life. In storytelling, the climax is defined not just by action, but by the collision of truth, tension, and emotion. The Thanksgiving Showdown is the narrative fulcrum of this story, the moment where years of invisibility, neglect, and quiet endurance confront deliberate betrayal. The competitor's script constructs this confrontation with precision, blending psychological intensity, emotional stakes, and measured pacing to create a scene that is both satisfying and resonant. The scene begins with familiar domestic imagery: the warm lighting, the long wooden table, the smell of roasted turkey, and the casual chatter of family members. This ordinary backdrop makes the impending confrontation more powerful because it contrasts the normalcy of family rituals with the weight of long-suppressed truths. The juxtaposition amplifies tension. The audience is acutely aware that the story is about to shatter the calm, turning a traditional gathering into a theater of revelation. At the center of the scene is the protagonist's calm control. Unlike many climactic confrontations that rely on raised voices or emotional outbursts, the narrator's power comes from composure and preparation. They enter the room with the folder containing undeniable evidence, tracking logs, timestamps, and signatures, physically placing truth on the table. This act of literalizing evidence symbolizes the broader theme of reclaiming agency. Where the narrator was once invisible and silenced, now they command attention without aggression. The script uses subtle gestures: the folding of a napkin, the steady placement of the folder to visually convey inner strength and emotional control. The competitor expertly layers family reactions to enhance dramatic tension. Helen's initial denial, Vanessa's forced composure, and Robert's hesitant awareness all serve to externalize the protagonist's internal conflict. By showing how each family member responds differently, the script underscores the complexity of familial dynamics. Guilt, shock, and denial collide with past patterns of favoritism and neglect. The audience experiences multiple perspectives, deepening engagement and empathy while heightening suspense. Psychologically, this showdown functions as a reckoning. The protagonist's carefully collected evidence transforms accumulated pain into a vehicle for recognition. Every signature, every timestamp, every delivery confirmation becomes a narrative weapon, not one of revenge, but of clarity. The scene explores the subtle power of truth in confronting injustice. It exposes intentional harm without need for dramatized anger. The emotional impact comes from precision, calmness, and undeniable proof. The audience sees justice delivered through evidence and composure rather than chaos. The pacing of this section is crucial. The reveal unfolds gradually: first the initial question from Helen, then the calm response, followed by the presentation of the folder, and finally the scanning of signatures. Each moment is measured, creating a crescendo of realization that carries both narrative and emotional weight. The climax is amplified not by shouting but by the silent recognition of truth as it dawns on family members, a technique that intensifies audience satisfaction and catharsis. Finally, the Thanksgiving Showdown illustrates the thematic heart of the story: reclaiming visibility, asserting truth, and achieving emotional autonomy. It demonstrates that confrontation does not require chaos. Strategic clarity, composure, and evidence can create resolution, empowerment, and transformation. The protagonist's victory is subtle yet profound. They have turned past invisibility into present recognition, rewriting family dynamics in a single, decisive act. Every story reaches a moment after the storm, where echoes of confrontation settle into silence, and characters are left to process the consequences of truth. In this narrative, the aftermath of the Thanksgiving Showdown serves as the emotional resolution, a space where tension diffuses, reflection deepens, and the protagonist's internal arc reaches its full clarity. Unlike climaxes that rely on external conflict, this section demonstrates that the quiet aftermath can be just as powerful, allowing both character and audience to inhabit the nuanced landscape of emotional truth. The competitor's script emphasizes controlled pacing and observation to portray resolution. After the revelation of the signatures, the story does not immediately pivot to reconciliation or dramatized confrontation. Instead, it dwells on small, meaningful reactions. Relatives shift in their seats, murmurs ripple through the room, Helen's pride falters, and Robert approaches with hesitant acknowledgement. These subtle gestures communicate more than dialogue could, showing that emotional truths often manifest in posture, hesitation, and silent acknowledgement rather than loud statements. The protagonist, in turn, absorbs these cues with calm and measured attention, reflecting a mastery over their own emotional responses. The narrative highlights the psychological liberation experienced by the protagonist. For years, they have been invisible, overlooked, and discounted, a pattern internalized from childhood. Now, having presented undeniable evidence and claimed their truth, they experience an emotional release that is profound but understated. This liberation is not about revenge or forcing others to acknowledge wrongdoing. It is about reclaiming agency, redefining personal worth, and establishing boundaries. The audience sees the protagonist stepping into autonomy, a stark contrast to the controlled, self-effacing figure from the opening sections. The subtlety of this shift, quiet, dignified, and self-contained, enhances its emotional resonance. Structurally, this section also allows for reflection on familial dynamics and self-perception. The protagonist recognizes that their value does not hinge on approval, apologies, or reconciliation from those who have caused harm. Helen's inability to meet their gaze, Vanessa's absence, and Robert's tentative apology all provide context for closure without dependency. By depicting the protagonist's emotional independence, the narrative reinforces the overarching theme: self-worth is intrinsic, and recognition from others, while meaningful, is not required to feel complete. This perspective deepens the story's psychological realism and resonates with audiences who have experienced neglect or dismissal. Cinematic techniques are evident even in the script's descriptive choices. The cold, crisp air outside the house, the quiet hum of post-dinner activity, and the protagonist walking away with the folder tucked under their arm all visually and symbolically reinforce the theme of renewal. The environment mirrors internal clarity, the air feels honest, the silence belongs to the narrator, and the past no longer dictates emotional reality. These details transform physical actions into emotional symbols, allowing readers to experience catharsis alongside the protagonist. Finally, this section underscores the enduring power of truth over drama. Resolution is achieved not through shouting or dramatic ultimatums, but through calm assertion, documentation, and measured revelation. By framing the aftermath as a moment of dignity, reflection, and emotional sovereignty, the narrative achieves a satisfying closure that honors the protagonist's journey from invisibility to recognition. It is here, in the quiet reclamation of agency, that the story's ultimate message crystallizes. Empowerment comes not from controlling others but from fully owning one's story, one truth at a time.